So, hello everybody to our course macroeconomics, and we have talked about GDP in general, and then last week we started to have a look at our system where we look in general at the main macroeconomic indicators, and later on we will have also a look on the dependence between these indicators. And not very surprisingly, one main indicator is the economic growth, so the relative change of GDP. And maybe you have heard of it that on Monday it was announced the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, and this was quite similar to the former year. There, Darren Acemoglu was awarded with the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he focused his research on economic growth, and he pointed out that especially the institutions of the society are one main determinant, and he compared societies over the last 100 years in their development. Do we have free market access and democracies versus we don't have it? And he could show that a democracy and free market structure really enhanced economic growth, that these countries on average had after decades a higher standard of living compared to other countries. And this year, and I have given you the link here at the homepage, the prize is awarded to these three guys: Joël Moncur, Philippe Aghion, a French guy, and Peter Hewitt from Canada. And they also focused on economic growth, and they found additional determinants, important determinants for economic growth, and especially these two guys, they built up a model where they took the idea of Schumpeter, and hopefully you have heard about Schumpeter in your introductory courses, because he was one of the famous economists in the beginning of the 20th century. So he developed around 1910, 1920 the idea of so-called creative destruction. So that if you have the structure of free markets, then everybody can compete with each other, and then you have a competition of ideas. And the best ideas, so to speak, will go on in time. But this, on the other hand, means also that ideas which do not perform that well in competitive markets have to leave the market. So that especially there will be enterprises which have to leave the market because they are not competitive anymore. But that this process of so-called creative destruction in the long run creates the possibility of a very good economic performance. And what they also found is that this process does not develop continuously in times, but that you always had in history jumps in innovation. That it really, you had that you had a break in the time series. And if you go back in history, then of course the first examples in modern history then are the steam machine in the United Kingdom in the 17th, 18th century, Industrial Revolution, then electricity in the 19th century, and maybe today we are also in such a point in time. If you look especially at digitalization, and right now, if you look what artificial intelligence means for the possibility to gain a higher productivity. And this, of course, I talked about this already a lot, is then up to you how to use these innovation. And we shouldn't be surprised that if in the next years or already right now we see this this process of creative destruction, so that many so-called old companies which do not incorporate these new possibilities will have to leave the market in the next years. And if somebody is interested, I gave you also here the link of the paper where where the ideas of Aguillon and Hewitt are based on. This paper they wrote in 1990, and here you can download it. And in general, this is a growth model incorporating this process of creative construction. So this means this is your production function, especially what you see here. In the end of the lecture, we will also talk about these assumptions that the first derivative is positive and the second derivative is negative of a production function. You remember we have already introduced when we talked about the income approach, about the production function depending on capital and labor. And let's see if we find this process of creative destruction directly, intermediate goods, and again. There is a research function, wages, and where do they model it? Let's see if I find it. Oh, no. Okay. So maybe I have to have a deeper look inside this paper, but if you are interested, you can also have a look inside. You can't hear me? Test, test. Yes, because here it's functioning. So I think it is a problem of your laptop or computer at home, because here it seems that everything is working. Okay, so this for the Nobel Prize in Economics, and then we will go on to look at steady and appropriate growth. There we had started the last week, and we had calculated, where is it? There. Also this chained index here of real GDP, and then calculated all the growth rates. And let's have a look at the development of economic growth in Germany since the introduction of the euro in 1990. And we talked about the difference between nominal and real GDP, and there you see that the numbers of real growth, the orange one, that these are always less than the nominal ones, and this means in general we have a positive price development, and if we go back in the recent years, then you see here the dramatic difference between nominal GDP growth rates and the real GDP growth rates. So these were the times with very high inflation rates of 5, 6, 7, and on the monthly basis, even two digits with more than 10% inflation rate. And this is quite important, and especially in these times of high price developments. This is really important that you keep in mind the difference between these two numbers, because the increase here you see in nominal GDP, the growth rates are the largest one over the last 25 years in Germany. But of course, and we talked about this last week, this does not mean that the standard of living the last 3 years really increased in Germany. It's even the other way around, because unfortunately, actually the last 2 years, you even see that although the nominal growth rates were quite high, that we had a decrease in real numbers. And there is only one exception if you look at the time series where real GDP had a higher growth rate than nominal GDP, but this was due to the disturbance because of the trade numbers and the trade prices, so because of export and import prices. Real GDP growth larger than nominal GDP growth because of the development of export and import prices. And if you remember, for Germany, the sum of exports and imports is almost as large as GDP. So relatively spoken, Germany is the largest trader in the world if you look at the large countries. Okay, and the next one here, then you see only the time series of the price development. So this is the change, the relative change of the GDP deflator. This is then roughly the difference between here the blue and the orange numbers, but you have to be a little bit careful since these are growth rates. So the relative change of prices is a growth rate, nominal GDP growth rate and real GDP growth rate. You cannot directly take the difference in order to obtain it. About this we have talked because you have, for the averaging, you have to take the geometric mean, and you cannot take, if you want to be mathematically exact, the the arithmetic mean. I think we should see this also within the numbers here. Yes, for example, if we would add up here the 7.05% plus 6.74%, then we end up with 13 0.79, and this is a difference of 0.5 percentage points compared to the mathematically exact number of 14.6%. So especially if you have quite high growth rates, so changes which move into the direction of 10%, then your error will be larger and larger. So if you have only growth rates of roughly 1 or 2%, then your error is somewhere in the third or the fourth digit. Then it doesn't matter that much. Okay, GDP deflator. And to summarize it, so the relative change of nominal GDP represents changes in prices and quantities, and the relative change of real GDP then represents the changes in quantities, and therefore this is what we want to look at when we talk about economic performance, or in general a change of standard of living if we use GDP as a welfare indicator. And if we then want to know what was only due to a change of prices in nominal GDP, then we have a look at the change of GDP deflator. And the last time series then, especially if we ask for GDP as a indicator of standard of living, as a welfare indicator, then of course it does not only matter the size of GDP, but if you then count it per head. And there I showed you also already numbers that over these 15 years, and for Germany, if you go back until the time of reunification in 1991, there we stayed more or less flat at 80 million inhabitants, but that this then changed significantly after the financial crisis. There we had some labor migration, because after the financial crisis, Germany performed economically quite good, and therefore we had an inflow of workers, especially from the southern part of Europe. I talked about the situation in Spain after the burst of the housing market bubble. There already you see that the blue is a little bit larger than the orange, where I calculated per capita GDP growth rates, and then 2015, 2016, this was the civil war in Syria, where we had more than 1 million refugees in Germany, and of course then here these are the refugees from Ukraine. So that's it for GDP growth, and now we go further back to our magic square, and now we want to talk about price level stability. How do we measure price level, the price level, and also why do we have this aim of price level stability? So what are the reasons? Why is this an economic aim? So why price level stability? Well, you have already seen quite often this market diagram with supply and demand. And then you argued, well, if you have a fully competitive and functioning market, that you then move into this equilibrium via, when you started from a point out of equilibrium, there you argued that you have forces which drives you into the market equilibrium. But this, of course, is then functioning via this price adjustment process. And therefore, we interpret prices as a signal of scarcity. And yeah, if you now look in general as on an economy where you have really large fluctuations, a high volatility in prices. So today I think standard bread is about 3 or 4 euros. And if you do not have an idea that tomorrow or in 1 week the price of this bread is roughly the same, it does not has to be the same, but roughly the same. So if you calculate your saving and consumption, maybe you are earning 2,000-3,000 euros per month, and then you say for food I will spend about 500 euros per month or something like this. Then you have the idea that a bread costs you roughly 3 or 4 euros. And if you have there a very high volatility, that you maybe have to expect in 1 week this bread will cost you 10 euros, then you have a problem to interpret this price as a signal of scarcity. Because of this volatility, yeah, you cannot really make your expectations about the future. And then you have a problem with this price adjustment processes in order to come to equilibrium. It's important, this does not mean that for single goods you should have absolutely stable prices and that the price of bread shouldn't change. But in general, in order to make your general overall decision, how much to save, how much to consume, think of the circular flow where we said we have an income, overall income, and then we decide how much we want to save and how much we want to consume. That the price level, so some kind of average of all prices, that this should be roughly stable, but not the price of single goods should be stable. Okay, and therefore this is maybe the main argument that the price level should be not too volatile. Also, if you think again about this process of savings, well, why are you save something? Maybe you have the idea to make a large holiday trip in 2 years. And then you are saving over time, over the next 2 years, maybe every month 50 euros. And if you now have high inflation rates, then of course over 2 years the costs of your holiday trip will increase. And so the possibility that you can store something via saving, so taking out of your income every month 50 euros, that this property of money is also in doubt. Because with high inflation rates, with the same amount of money, with the same 1,000 euros, you can buy less than in the future if you have, let's say, like in the last 3 years, an inflation of 5 or 10%. We all see this if we go out dancing in the disco tonight. The drinks are much more expensive than 4 years ago, or even 2 years. Yeah. So, well, to store with money your value over time. This is also disturbed then. And of course, if always the prices are changing, then you have always make a new declaration of the prices. And this is then called the so-called menu costs. You have always to write a new table. Well, in digital times, this is not that important anymore. But in general, this is also some kind of transaction cost, which you have when the prices are always changing. General transaction costs. Yeah, well, if you go to the supermarket and then you see at the counter a liter milk costs you €1.10. And if this now changes to the next week to €1.20, then somebody has to change the sign from €1.10 to €1.20. And this guy has also to be paid for his work, and this is then somehow transaction costs which you have if the prices are continuously changing in general. It's also, of course, it's also a new declaration. And then again, think of the circular flow for especially a modern economy. We have the sector of financial institutions where we collect all the money in order to give a credit, in order to make large investments. And if you get out a credit, then you get the money today, and then you have a plan, let's say 1 million, to repay your credit over the next 10 years. So then I get today 1 million euros, and I can spend this, I can buy something to the actual prices today. And then I repay over the next 10 years. And again, think of high inflation rates. Then this means that the guy who gave me the million euros gets back, so to speak, bad money. He gets back his 1 million euros, but if you have high inflation rates during the next 10 years, then he can buy with this 1 million euros less goods than I could buy today when I directly got this money. So this would then somehow mean that you have somehow some kind of injustice between this relation of creditor and debtors. And this will also mean if you have high volatilities in the price development, that then you have some friction in this process of creditors and debtors. And well, this is then also a bad situation for the whole economy overall, because then, of course, you have the problem to especially make these large investments. And this was, if you look at the data, somehow a problem, especially in Europe with these high inflation rates. And later on, we will also see we had high inflation rates and directly also a very large increase in interest rates. And this especially meant that in the private sector, the people, the companies, they more or less sit on their money in Europe and not doing the relevant investments for the future. Especially also the large investments in an infrastructure, digitalization, and so on. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not because we do not have the money, but because we do not invest the money for the future. Yeah, yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and overall, for and here think again of this appropriate economic growth. There, it is helpful if you have a more or less stable situation in the calculation. How much do I consume and how much I am saving? And I said already to you in Germany, roughly the savings rate is a little bit more than 10%. And if this also always fluctuates, then again, you have also a problem in your credit process and for the investments. So you see there are quite a lot good arguments not for stable prices for single goods, but for stable price level. And this means we measuring with the price development more or less the value of money, and this we are doing then with an average process, and again similar to the case what we have done looking at GDP growth, we calculate a so-called price index, and for this we make a choice of the representative basket. So at which goods should we look? And this then means we look at what we call a representative consumer. So what is a guy in Germany on average buying within 1 year, roughly spoken. And then, of course, let's say, yeah, a bread we are buying every week. But a washing machine we are buying only, let's say, every 5 years. But both are consumption goods, and then it would not be a good idea to just add up the price of 1 liter milk plus the price of one washing machine. And therefore, we introduce the relevant weights of these two goods. And let's then say we have 52 weeks in a year. So then we have about 52 breads, which we are buying over 1 year. And let's say for euros, 52, this is then roughly 200 euros, which what we spent for bread over 1 year. A washing machine, maybe 500 euros with a price of 500 euros, but only every 5 years. So then I would divide this by 5. Then I end up with 100 euros, and then somehow I can calculate from this the weight for which with which a bread should enter my price index and the weight with which a washing machine should enter my price index. So if I at first have identified all relevant goods and the weights, and then I just look up the prices, and then I just calculate weight time price of my good, and I'm summing all up. And this is then just the value of my basket. And again, then I take some base here. And since I'm again not interested or not that much interested in the absolute value of this basket, but in the change, because I want to calculate the inflation rate, the relative change of prices. Then I take again some base year, set again this number, this index for the base year to 100, and then I can calculate the inflation by just the relative change of my index. So inflation is then index again today minus index yesterday over the index yesterday. Yeah, and in order again to compare the numbers for different countries, it is a good idea that every country is calculating this index in the same way. And for this, we have the so-called in Europe harmonized index of consumer prices. And this is then just the weighted arithmetic mean of the single goods in of our prices. And here, hopefully this works now. Here you can go to the homepage of Eurostat. And of course, here we look at one representative consumer. And what he or she buys doesn't have to coincide to what you are buying. And if you, so to speak, want to calculate your personal inflation rate, then yeah, you can go here to the homepage of Eurostat, and there you can then put in your individual weight and then just compare this to the official inflation rate. Yes, yeah, because if you then calculate your decision how much to save, then in general, not the average price development is the right indicator for you, but your price development, your personal price development. And maybe it differs a lot. If you maybe have more expenditures for your flat or you are going out quite often, then of course for food or for restaurants, you have another weight than the official one. Do we see it here? Oh no, this is a pity. How much this would be the official one. Okay, and here also if you want to have a look for the German one, this is then almost the same as the harmonized price index, and here also you can calculate your personal price development. Maybe here. again, but also we don't see the official ones. Okay, anyway. Yeah, and this, oh, here we see it. This is the weighting scheme of this harmonized price index, and this is also the link to the index. And then, as we did it for economic growth, there I said, well, the quantitative aim is for development then roughly a growth rate between 1 and 3%. Then we ask also, what do we understand by price stability in the Eurozone? And there we can really say this is a difference to the other economic indicators, that we have here a definite target, because this is formulated by the European Central Bank, that they have defined via the governing council, that we understand price stability if we have an inflation rate of 2% measured by the harmonized consumer price index, and that this target should be symmetric. So we allow for fluctuation above and below 2% in a symmetric way. So we shouldn't allow 10%, but if we have for 1 or 2 years 2.5 or 3%, then this means we are still more or less on track with the symmetric target of 2%. Actually, some years ago, I tried to find out, because if you then look at the most central banks in the world, then you almost always find an inflation target of 2% or a little bit more, maybe 3%. So it's almost always the same, but actually nobody could explain me why it is 2%. So it does not come out of some model or something. Why is it not 4? Why is it not 5? Why is it not 1? So it is just then more or less it's coming from an historic development, that overall we committed us more or less in all developed economies to roughly that we understand 2% as price stability. Yeah, this I have written down at the former slide already. So inflation is just the relative change of the consumer price index. T is today and T minus 1, the former period, so yesterday. Well, and then let's do also a little example that we, again, similar to economic growth, we look at a situation where we have two goods, and now we have the development of the price of these two goods. We have here the weight. So the first product, milk, should have a weight of 30%, and the other one should have a weight of 70%. And hopefully this works, that I just click in this, and again I will perform this calculation directly in Excel. So what would be the value of our basket in 2017? What do I have to calculate if I just plug in the definition that consumer price index or the basket is then just the weighted average of our single prices? Yeah, but this is then inflation. There we need the former one, but we just want to start. What is the value of the basket? And the value of the basket is the weighted arithmetic mean of our single prices. I think you have done descriptive statistics and talked about weighted averages. Yeah, louder. Yeah, yes, yeah, definitely. So price times weight plus price times weight. So let's go back to our definition here. Here we had this definition, or then let's write out this Greek summation sign. This means just G1 P1 plus G2 P2 plus G3 P3 plus Gn Pn, and the sum of all weights should be 1. And G1 G2 G3 plus Gn, the sum of Gi I from 1 to n, that this should be 1, so 100%. This seems reasonable, yeah. So 1 times 30% plus 0.8 times 0.7. And this one, of course, we have to do for every year. So let's copy this, putting it downward. Then the price index there, going back. We set in some base year, we set it to 100. Let's start with the first year. And then if 0.86 should be represented by 100, what is then the index in 2080 if the value of the basket has increased from 0.86 to 1.03? What do I have to calculate? Pardon? Uh, no, not 2%, but you have here the development of the value. So the relative change of the price index now has to be the same as the relative change of the value of the basket. This is actually the same calculation which we have already done performing the calculation for economic growth. Yes, yes. So 1.03 divided by 0.86 times our starting point, the 100. And the next one is then 1.045 divided by 1.03, now divided with a starting point of 190. But again, this is the same formula, so I can just copy this formula to the next year. And now your idea, now we are ready to calculate the inflation rate. Again, plugging in just the definition that the inflation rate is the relative change of our price index. And here you were totally right. For the year 2017, we have to compare it to 2016, but there we have no data, so we cannot calculate the inflation rate of 2017, but we can calculate the inflation rate of 2018. What do I have to do? Yes, and this is then 19.76%. So equals, opening brackets, minus 100 divided by 100. And the next one is then 121 minus 119 divided by 119. Same formula. Copying down means this, and let's reformat this. Percent. And this we can also reformat a little bit. Number 2. Okay. So, and then I pose also the question, after we have the inflation rates from 2018 and 2019, what is the average inflation rate? No. Again, an inflation rate is nothing else than a growth rate. So in order to average it, we again have to apply this geometric mean of the inflation factors. But let me then again write it down here. Average inflation rate. And inflation, we quite often use the Greek letter pi. This means, what do we need? We need the average, so the constant inflation rate over 3 years, starting from 100, ending up at 121.5. So again, 100 times for the first year, 1 plus pi bar, the average inflation rate, pi bar, sorry. But another year, now we are in the year 2018. Now we want to move to the year 2019 times 1 plus pi bar. Now we are in the year of 2019. So this equals then 121.51. And this, if we solve this for pi bar, we obtain then 1 plus pi bar squared equals 121 point over 100. Taking the root means 1 plus pi bar is the square root of 121.51 over 100. And in order to see that this is a geometric averaging, I write this part here, this ratio, in another way. That I write this as 121.51 over the index of the former year, 119.77, and times 119.77 divided by the index of our starting point. So you see that this is the same because the 190 just cancels out. So the left side and the right side are the same. But what is this here? This is just the inflation factor of the year 2018. this is 1 plus pi 2018, and this is 1 plus pi, sorry, 2019 is this, and this is 2018. So this is then the geometric mean of the inflation factors 1 plus pi. And again, you can use the arithmetic mean in the case if you have low inflation rates. If the inflation rates, so maybe just more or less on target of the European Central Bank, around 2%, then the error which you are making using the arithmetic mean is not that large. But if you go just back in time 2 years where we had these high inflation rates, then averaging inflation, you have to use this geometric mean. Okay, but as in the economic growth case, let's also write down how we got here some numbers. So the first one, this was 1 times 0.3 plus 0.8 times 0.7. Let's take this one. This was 1.03 over 0.86 times 100. This was 0.86 and this was then 100. 1977, and this was then 121.51 minus 119.77 over 119.77. That you can recapitulate what I have done, but I will also upload it, and then you can click in, and then you also see the formulas I have used. But we should then now also calculate the average growth rate. For this, let's calculate the inflation factor. For 2018 and 2019. And this was just 1 plus the inflation rate. So equals 1 plus the inflation rate, so 1.1977. And 1 plus this, but this we shouldn't show in percent. So reformatting it in a number. Let's take 3 digits, and these are then our, or let's take 4 digits, it's better. Our inflation factors, and then we obtain the average inflation rate as the square root of the inflation factors, and then for getting the inflation rate we have to subtract minus 1. Where is it? Oops. This has a time. Oops, multiply this. Now we are in business. Roughly 10%. So the average inflation rate would be then pi bar equals 10.23%. Okay, so and yeah, in general, the representative basket has roughly 300 or 400 single goods, and then you would have to calculate this with 400 numbers and not only with two. But the procedure would be the same. You have a question? Hmm? Yep, this one. Square root. Oh, this is the German. Yeah. So if you have on your laptop the English version, then this would be SQRT for square root. Here, this is 1 plus the inflation. So this is just 1 plus 19.77%. Well, let's write down it. This would be then better. So this is 1 plus 19.77%. This is 1 plus 1.46%, and this would be then square root of 1.1977 times 1.0146 minus 1. And this, of course, is the same number as this number here. Maybe we can write down this also, that this is equal to 119.77 over 100, and this is equal to 121.51 over 119.77. Okay, but in this case, or for the consumer price index, we looked at the representative consumer. And of course, we have other parts of the economy so that we also look at other price indices. So consumer price index, this is when we measure in general inflation. Remember, here we are looking only at our private consumption goods. And remember, looking at GDP overall, this is the largest component with roughly 55%, but it is not total GDP. And for total GDP, we had this price index of GDP deflator. And this is then here relevant for private consumption, roughly 55% of GDP. But looking at the whole economy, especially looking also at the large investment goods, in the private consumption basket, we do not find a large truck or something like this. And if we look at the overall whole economy, then the GDP deflator is, so to speak, the price index for the whole economy. There you have always to be a little bit careful that you do not mix this up, but later on we will also, when we have a look at the labor market, what is the relevance, or where do we find in the economy the relevance of these two different indicators? Then, of course, export and import prices are also important in order to get an expectation where will be inflation tomorrow, especially if we look for Germany. We do not have many raw materials, especially no energy. We have to buy oil, gas, and so on from abroad. And therefore, if the import prices are increasing, then we should not be surprised that within some days, weeks, or months, also the inflation is increasing. And this was the case when we stopped buying gas from Russia, that during 21, 22, we had this large increase of energy prices, and this then translated into high inflation rates. So this is then called the imported inflation. And what we can also say, if we look at the wholesale price index, so we see the price in the supermarket, but the manager of the supermarket, he is buying his goods at the wholesale market. And if there happens something, if the wholesale prices are increasing, again, not directly, but within some time, that this feeds also through to the inflation rate. And therefore, we say that a development in the wholesale price index is somehow an early indicator of where will be inflation in the future. Yeah, for sure. For sure. We cannot do it. But if we see their developments, then of course, if their milk is increasing, then we should not be surprised that in 1 week also the milk prices at the counter in the supermarket are increasing. And therefore, I told you that I do these economic forecasts for roughly 10, 15 years. And there, if we make our forecasts about inflation, then of course we look at the energy prices for the maybe imported inflation tomorrow and for the wholesale prices when we make our forecast for inflation. And we have some time left, so we will end this topic also as the former one, that we look at the developments of inflation in Germany. And okay, most of you are coming from abroad, but in Germany, quite often the people talk about the good times in history, and especially the time when we had our own currency, the German mark, that there everything was much better. The German mark was much more stable than the euro. And if we look then here from the time 1970 to 1991, introduction of the euro, that you see here the volatility during this time having our own currency was much higher, and also the average. So what we then had in the argumentation, why price stability? Because of the value of money in the future should be stable, that you can store your value over time, that the average inflation rate with the German mark was almost 2 times higher than the average inflation rate since we have the euro. So actually we are with the euro, if we look only at this aspect, the long-term average inflation rate, then we are quite on track with this target of 2%. Of course, this is not a funny time because we had quite long a very stable development of inflation in the time period with the euro, but the last 3 years there we had also quite high fluctuation and very high inflation rates. Yeah, and here this is the monthly development, and then of course you see that we have a quite higher fluctuation with a monthly period, and right now we are more or less back at the target. And the last thing what I want to do with you is that sometimes we have to be a little bit careful interpreting the inflation rate. Well, this is the basket of all consumption goods, because especially sometimes the overall inflation is mostly driven by only one good. And which is it? Well, in general, of course, energy, and there the oil price is still, so to speak, the most important good in the world. And here you see that energy prices, this is the orange line, that energy prices could over 1 year quite often fluctuate with plus minus 20% or even more. And you see that the inflation rate is much less volatile. And then, in order to get an idea what is the impact of this high volatility on overall price developments, we have to know, what is the weight of the energy component, and energy is roughly 10% of the whole basket. And what this would mean, for this we will do also a little calculation, that we take this weight of CPI of energy of 10%, and this is the recent situation that we come from an oil price of roughly 100 US dollar per barrel, and this has decreased to 60 over the last year. And let's then assume that roughly energy prices have come down over 1 year by 15%. And now we want to calculate what is inflation if all prices staying the same, nothing changes, except the energy prices has been fallen by 15%. Well, and for this we can say, well, we start with an index of 100. Let's say this is last year, and this 100 splits into two components. One energy component, 0.1, and we start with the energy price index, also setting this to 100. So this should be CPI. This is energy plus, of course, 0.9 also times 100, and this is of course adding up to 100. And this is the non-energy component. And now, what would be our price index today when we have all prices are staying the same without the energy component? Yes, but for this at first we need the CPI for this year, and this we have to calculate. So, what has happened to our non-energy component? Development of this index. 100. It stays constant. And what happens to the, or what should has happened to the energy index? Falling by 15%. Yeah, 85. Yes. So 85, adding this up is then 90 plus 8.5, so 98.5 overall. And now you can step in. What is then inflation? The other way around, yeah? Because we have a decrease, so we have a negative inflation rate. So 98.5 minus 100 over 100, and this is then minus 1.5 over 100, so minus 1.5%. Yeah, and this means if you think again about the target of 2% inflation rate, that although this is only 10% of the overall price index, but due to the high volatility of this energy component, this means if nothing else changes, only the oil price has changed, that then also the overall inflation rate is falling by 1.5%. And this is right now the main explanation that we have come down that fast back in the neighborhood of 2%. Because still we have quite high energy prices compared with the last 10 years. They are still high, but the energy prices were even much higher the last year. And this is then what we right now see, more or less only this base effect. We come from very high energy prices. This component drops by 10-20%, but it's still high. We are paying still quite high prices for energy compared to 2018 or something like this. And this really has moved down the inflation rate. And therefore, if we now go on and if we in the next 6 months have not anymore this comparison between coming down from very high energy prices, that this means that in the next months we should not be surprised that again the inflation rate is increasing, because this base effect vanishes right now. We are now in October, and in the last October, energy prices has been already quite low compared to the other years. Maybe we can see this, the energy prices I had down here. Yeah. Oh no, this is 2024. We don't see this already, but this base effect will vanish the next month. Uh, you cannot not at because we are importing our energy from all over the world. Um, well, you see for the heating that it comes a little bit up, but in general, since oil is needed also for the whole chemical industry, and so it you see it a little bit, but it is not a strong effect, not a strong seasonal effect which you have there. Okay, then we are through for today, and tomorrow we will go on with the next target, the labor market and the unemployment rate. So, thank you very much for today.